advice. So I wanted to look, I was given free rein. They said talk about whatever you would like to talk about, and I thought I'd like to give a talk on a poem of Bante's. I've been looking a bit more at Sangharakshita's poetry, partly because there's these interviews that he gave with Sadhanandi where he goes into all his poems and talks about what they mean. So, oh, they're being closed now. Actually, in some of Bante's early lectures, you can hear all the ambulance going past. It's quite sweet. For some reason, I think, oh, that was someone going. And actually, what I realised is one of them could have been me, because I was born next to the LBC. And my mother was taken there in an ambulance in 1978. So sometimes I listen to these ambulances in a talk in 1978 and think, oh, maybe that was me. Anyway, so Bante gave these talks, these he had these interviews around his poetry. And I think it gives us a bit of a different taste of who Sangharakshita is. You know, sometimes we can think Sangharakshita is very scholarly. I remember when I first came along, this shows you how long ago it was, but we used to have cassettes. We had every single talk on a cassette. And I remember thinking, like, who is this guy? You know, I was 17 and I was like on the lookout for any kind of pretense. And so I thought, who is this guy? So I listened to the whole lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can't remember how many there were. There you go. You bought them, yeah, that was a level above. I just took them out of the library. Anyway, so you can get the sense he's quite scholarly, but his poetries give a different sense of his life. And I think this poem in particular has a particular mood to it that I really can feel in my own meditation practices, particularly at the moment. So this poem has become quite important to me, and I just wanted to share some reflections about it with you. So we've heard it before in this room, before the tea break, but I'll read it again. I listened all day for the knock of the stranger, and I often looked out from the door. The table was scrubbed, the brass shining, and well swept the floor. The shadows grew longer and longer. In the grate the fire flickered and died. It's too late, he will never come now, I said and sighed. I sat there musing and musing, the spinning wheel still at my side. The moonlight came in through the window, white like a bride. As the clock struck 12, I heard nothing, but felt he had come and stayed, waiting outside, and I listened, and I was afraid. So I'm not choosing this poem particularly for its literary merit, by the way. Some people like Sangharakshita's poems. Some people struggle with them. Sometimes I think they're better set to music, actually, because they're very rhythmic. They're very similar. This particular one is very similar to the poetry of Kabir. And if we have time, I'll read you a particular poem of Kabir's, which uses the same imagery. It's very devotional in nature. Kabir himself came from 15th century Indian. He came from the Bhakti tradition, which is the kind of devotional Indian religious tradition. And I think there's Sangharakshita himself talked about a kind of conflict in his life between what he calls Sangharakshita 1 and Sangharakshita 2. So Sangharakshita 1, I think it's this way around, was very, very scholarly, a monk, very, very rational, really wanted to know the truth, studied Pali, went deeply into the Buddhist scriptures in the original language to make sense of them. And then there's Sangharakshita 2, who's the poet-dreamer, who just liked to stare out of the window and contemplate the universe and feel things deeply. And he said they got into this terrible conflict, and they got into such bad conflict that one of them burnt the other one's poems. And interestingly, I won't go into this, but I'm pretty sure I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that it was the figure of Padmasambhava who brought together for Sangharakshita the poet, scholar, and the the scholar monk and the poet dreamer. But if anyone finds that, I might have made it up, I have a terrible imagination that just sort of proliferates endlessly, and sometimes I have to go back to the source to make sure I haven't actually made something up. There we go. So I just wanted to unpack the mood of that poem a little bit. So the first part of the poem is about preparation. So we've got an image of someone who's cleaned up. The table was scrubbed, the brass shining, and well swept the floor. So this is all a kind of preparation for the stranger. We'll think about who that is later. But something is coming that's unknown and strange. And there's preparation for the stranger. But who is preparing? Sangharakshita, when he talks about this, says it's definitely a woman. There's a spinning wheel there, which is traditionally associated with women's work. And the light comes through white like a bride. He said it's like the imagery that he was thinking of was like an old-fashioned bride waiting for her husband, or waiting for her wedding to someone that she didn't really know. And that's, of course, the old-fashioned way things happened and still happen in certain parts of the world, that you wouldn't necessarily know who you were marrying. So there, he said, it's like you want to get married. Well, hopefully you want to get married. Never really wanted to get married myself, but but there's that feeling of wanting this kind of union and it not happening, or it's just about to happen, and you're waiting to find out who this person's going to be that you're going to spend the rest of your life with, which is a huge thing if you think about it. You know, a bride would leave home and go and live with the husband's family, and she wouldn't even know who he was. So he wasn't really talking about gender roles or the history of marriage throughout the world. What he was trying to evoke there was, he said, soul. You know, it's more like a fable or a story that's trying to provoke a mood. And it's that mood of anticipation. And he said that the woman represents soul in the neoplatonic sense, which means really the kind of deep-rooted emotions. The body, the part of us that's the intermediary between thought and the world. It's a very kind of earthy, loving presence, this woman, feeling things deeply. So I think he's more trying to talk about a kind of emotional landscape, an emotional landscape which is anticipating something extremely important and desired and unknown. And in order to wait for this kind of happening, this union, traditionally in myths and stories, marriage is about union. It's about two opposites coming together. But in order to anticipate this union, we have to prepare. The prepared mind in Pali is Kalyachitta, which some of you know that I live with someone called Kalyachitta. Actually, it's a good name. The more I know her, I think it's a good name. She has got a kind of prepared mind. And the imagery there is that in order to receive the truth about reality, we have to prepare our mind. So it's very, very important in the Buddhist tradition how we prepare our mind to receive the truth. There's many ways in you could look at this. In a way, the simplest is a line from the Dharmapada, which is a very early Buddhist text, which is cease to do evil, learn to do good, purify the mind. So purify the mind. I've been thinking a bit about this because I don't think it's saying, definitely in the Buddhist tradition, it's not saying that people are impure and bad and wrong and then they need to purify themselves. I think what it's trying to point at is an aesthetic, it's an aesthetic practice. It's the effort, what Sangharakshita calls the effort to be aesthetically active. So it's not a moral judgment. I don't think Buddhists go in terribly for moral judgments, which is very, very fortunate in my case. All I received, I mean, I really was kind of looking back on it, I think, gosh, I was on the end of such kindness. I used to turn up to the Buddhist centre in all sorts of states. I won't go into it. And they were so kind to me, but no one ever gave me a kind of moral judgment. And I was on the lookout, partly because I was very naughty. So I had been expelled from various schools and thrown out of the Catholic Church. So I was wondering what the Buddhists were going to make of me. And they just knew I'd grow out of it, basically. They just gave me a cup of tea and a biscuit. So yes, thank goodness. And I really got that from Sangharakshita himself as well. He doesn't go in for sort of strong moral judgments. He more talks about ethics in terms of aesthetics, in terms of beauty. It's almost like in the Buddhist tradition, what you've got to do is you've got to feel your way into what's good and what's beneficial and what's skillful and ethically positive. In the Dharmapada, they say, be quick to do what is beautiful. And that's ethics to me. That's kind of a purification of mind, is to do what connects myself with other people in the world. You know, do what brings people together. Do what's kind and loving. And not because it's good or because the Buddha said so, but because deep in your being, you know that that's what's beautiful. There's something about the human capacity or the human awareness, the human consciousness itself, that responds to what's beautiful and good and true. In Buddhism, we say what's kalyana, or in Pali, it's kalyana. This quality of what's good, true and beautiful. And within the human spirit, if you like, there's a deep understanding of that and a deep resonance with that. We sort of know it. You don't have to teach people morality. And I have done that. I've taught so many beginners courses, and I've taught children and all sorts of people about ethics. And you never go and say, right, this is what the Buddha said and you've got to do it. You say, okay, well, what do you think? What do you think is an ethical action? Like, imagine someone you admire and say what they would do. And you always come out with the same things. You don't ever come out with anything weird. Or, you know, we all know what's ethically good because it's beautiful. And we all know what's what we call in Buddhism unskillful or constricted. It's almost like if we're in states of disassociation or disconnection with others or disconnection with what's true, the senses constrict and we get into this kind of tight sort of what Sangharakshita calls a kind of tight ball that just goes in on itself. And we all know that as well. We all know the unbeautiful. We all know what it's like to be in a state of mind where we feel closed off and constricted and tight. So the verses from the Dharmapada recommend that we learn to do what's good, which means that we get into a kind of habit of goodness. Every situation in life presents us with an opportunity to either do what is beautiful or what is unbeautiful. And the more we choose the beautiful, the more beautiful our reality becomes. The more beautiful we become, the more beautiful our experience of the world becomes. So we change our habit of mind. But what Buddhism also says is that if you change your habit of mind towards the beautiful, towards love and gratitude and connection and kindness, it does something very, very radical with the nature of consciousness, which is that it makes your consciousness more able to receive the truth about the way things are, because you're acting in line with the way things are. Because the way things are say that we're not disconnected, that we're not alienated from each other, that actually we are part of life. We're part of each other's lives, we're part of the world, we're part of the environment, and that we also have the capacity to achieve limitless compassion, wisdom and energy. We have the capacity for Buddhahood. That's reality. So when we act in line with the truth of reality, when we act in this beautiful way and that connects us to reality, we open our mind to see the way things are. In the Buddhist scriptures, you come across this kind of repeated phrase again and again, which is And so, with mind concentrated, purified and cleansed, unblemished, free from impurities, malleable, workable, established, and having gained stability, they direct and incline their mind towards knowing and seeing. So there's something, these phrases, they're not like a list that you have to necessarily go into and find out what exactly each of those words mean, which I sometimes actually do, if I'm honest. But it's more a kind of poetical feeling when your mind is open and concentrated and stable and malleable. They say it's like you can work it like gold. It's like when you have hard gold and you heat it up, and then you're able to sort of move it into these beautiful shapes. They say the mind's like that. You can create a state of mind that is more able to receive the truth. And of course, that's what we're doing in meditation. And I think, yes, I think what we can do is we can also learn to exercise a certain faculty that we have, this faculty that responds to what is beautiful. We can actually develop it. We can use it like a kind of muscle. If we keep moving towards the beautiful and the true and the good, it means that we'll cultivate that state of mind more fully, and we become it. We become good and beautiful and true. I think this responsiveness as well is the reason that human beings can gain enlightenment. Because we have this responsiveness to what's good, true and beautiful, and it's within us. We don't have to invent it. We don't have to sort of get it from a Buddhist center or a book and put it inside us. It is who we are. Because we have that capacity, we are able to see into the way things are. We're able to gain enlightenment. And all we have to do in order to see into the way things are is use that faculty that we already have. I kind of think that's what the Buddhist path is about developing a faculty we already have and learning to recognize it. And that's why I trust it. Because if it was imposed from outside of me, I just wouldn't trust it. Yeah. Very simply, the Buddha said, the clean cloth takes the dye. And traditionally in Buddhist teachings, what you'd have is you'd have part of the talk would be about ethical practice and loving what's good. They talk about loving what's good. And then the second part of the talk would be more specific insight teachings in order to gain liberation. And we all know that. We all know that it's very hard to receive the truth if your mind is constricted and it's full of its latest drama. That's why we meditate in a class. You know, you come to a class, there's a preoccupation, something's happened with a friend or at work, and it's got that horrible quality where it goes round and round and round your head and you can't break free of it. And then you come to the Buddhist center and they say, just sit down and meditate. And we do the metta bhavana. And through that, suddenly you're able to, the mind opens, and then something of a magical quality can happen. And Bhante says, in a way, the main thing is to have a simple life. He says the imagery in the poem is about having a simple life. I think the thing about the simple life is it's really good not to underestimate a simple life. A simple life is also a beautiful life. Sometimes I used to think that a simple life would be quite boring. And then I got older. And then I learned to appreciate a simple life and what that actually meant. When Kabir uses the same imagery of the spinning wheel and the woman waiting, because it is in Kabir's poetry as well, he gives a quite different image of the spinning wheel. So I'll tell you his imagery. He says, the wheel of ecstatic love turns around in the sky, and the spinning seat is made of the sapphires of work and study. This woman weaves threads that are subtle, and the intensity of her praise makes them fine. So you can think like it's a really boring spin. I think I did try spinning wool once, and I really thought, you know, technology has just moved on. And I never did that again. So, you know, I can kind of dismiss a sort of simple imagery, but actually Kabir is saying, no, you have this simple thing, you have this, this spinning wheel, which is, you know, it takes a lot of time as well, and you have to gather the wool, and then you do this thing, and then you spin it into a string. You can tell I'm not a weaver, but anyway. You can think it's very simple, but actually something very profound is going on. The wheel is not just a normal wooden wheel, it's the wheel of ecstatic love. And the spinning seat is made of jewels of work and study. And I think that's what preparation is like. We can think it's simple, you know, going to learn to meditate and studying Buddhist texts and discussing the Dharma with people. You can think that's very simple, but actually something very, very profound is happening. It's actually, you're turning the wheel of ecstatic love. I remember having this dream when I was taking on quite a major responsibility in the order, and I had this dream that I was in this beautiful big white building, absolutely stunning. This room, absolutely huge room that I was meant to move into. This is now my bedroom. This big white room with very, very high ceilings. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm just not going to be able to fill this room. And then I thought, oh no, I remembered, I've got something in the basement. So I went down into the basement and I brought out this big tanka, which is a Buddhist, you'll see them, they're kind of scrolls of Buddhist paintings. I went down into the basement and I got this tanka and I brought it up to this big white room and I unrolled it. And it was a woven and a plique image of white Tara, and we've heard a bit about Tara, who's, yes, the quintessence of compassion. It's the image of the Buddha's mind of wisdom and compassion in female form. And there was this huge, great tanka, and I realised that it was woven with all the threads of my practice over all those years. Every single time I turned up to meditate, every single time I read or discussed the Dharma with people, every time I befriended people at the Buddhist Center and talked about my spiritual life, every single one of those moments was a stitch that had woven together, unknowingly to me, this beautiful picture of white Tara, and I just hung it up in this white room. So yes, so we prepare the mind. But we mustn't think that everyone's going to look the same. So I remember having this very interesting dialogue with someone, actually, who was really quite reactive to me, which is always very helpful, actually. Sometimes when people really don't like you, they're kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Why don't you like me? Anyway, so I got into dialogue with her because she was saying, it was really interesting, because I was saying that in the early Buddhist texts, you have this imagery that when you offer flowers, it's a bit mad, but anyway, when you offer flowers, the flowers turn into a kind of fragrant chamber, and then the Buddha enters this kind of fragrant hut. It's called the Gandakuti, the fragrant chamber. And when I was reading about these stories about, you know, someone offers flowers and the flowers magically take shape into this hut, and then the Buddha, like a meditation hut, and the Buddha enters. And the academic who was writing about it gave this phrase, which is, the Buddha comes where the flowers are. And I thought that was wonderful. Like, the Buddha comes where the flowers are. You know, you prepare your mind, you make it centered, and then the Buddha will arrive. And she really didn't like this imagery, because she said, no, but I'm not going to be like that. My garden is wild and it's full of weeds, and there's no preparation of offering things to the Buddha. It's like the Buddha's going to come into my garden however it is. And I thought, oh, where do we go from here? There we go. But I could see there was concern in her that I thought was really interesting. Her concern was that she had to look a particular way to be a Buddhist, and that it had to be like she had to have this kind of cultivated garden that she didn't like. I kind of with her on that in some ways. Julie and I, we went to those allotments, didn't we? And we were sitting out in those allotments, and I really liked it because they're a bit shambolic and there's wood everywhere, and kind of crazy flowers growing out of weird places. So I can kind of see what the attraction to that would be. But what it made me think is, yes, the flowers that you offer don't have to look the same, and they don't have to be particularly polished. I don't think it's a question of having to conform to an ideal that we think we should be. Particularly in Buddhism, you have imageries of very calm, very peaceful, usually monks. But you don't have to be like that to be a Buddhist. You just have to prepare your mind. And how you prepare your mind is unique to each individual. And it might take a certain amount of sorting oneself out and settling down and taking responsibility for one's mental states. I definitely feel like I had to do that. That preparation, is happening all the time. But there's a preparation to fully take responsibility for my mental states and the effect that my mind has on the world. To give you an example of that, I went on a solitary retreat once, and a lot of people around me had been having quite strong insight experiences, which was encouraging in one way, and in another way, what it meant was when I went on solitary retreat, I realised that my mind was very constricted around a goal of having insight, which is like the worst preparation for insight that you can have, because you're not actually open to reality. There's grasping, and there was a grasping after a certain state of mind and an aversion of my current state of mind, and that constricted my mind, which meant I was unable to see what was going on. And what I had to do was just learn how to look at flowers. So the preparation for me there was just to go and bird watch, there was a bird book and some binoculars, and I just thought, wow, I'm so bored that I'm going to have to look at birds, which was great. That was the best thing that I could do. And it's taken me a long time. I think it's taken me a long time to be able to just look at a flower. I'm a very active sort of person. And to look at artwork. I think there's a real benefit to living in a city where you can go to the same piece of art again and again and again and again. Just that one thing, and really look. Open your mind to the piece of artwork and what the person creating it was communicating. Remember my father, he's very, very wonderful man, my father. And when I was really from quite young, he took me to art exhibitions in London. He said, right, there's a technique to this. It's big. The ones in London can be huge, probably the same in Berlin. And he said, right, we're going to walk round once fairly quickly, take it all in, and then we're just going to go back to one thing that really moves you. And he said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it's by or whether it's important or popular or they've made a postcard of it. You just go back to that one piece and just feel it. Just sit with that piece of art. So in a way, that was really good advice for, for Buddhist practice, which was to just stop and see what's there and see it deeply. And keep on doing that. Keep on being alive to one's current experience and reflecting on it deeply. Sangharakshita said about this poem, he says, it's not that you prepare and then you stop preparing and get some sort of result or fruit. No, in the preparation itself, you experience the end. So yes, so we can invite the stranger, we can invite the unknown in through preparation of mind. A bit like inviting a guest. It does prepare. I've done quite a bit in India, and one of the things they do in a program in India is there's a long bit at the beginning where they garland Dr. Ambedkar and offer flowers to the picture of Sangharakshita, and then they sing this beautiful thing called the Buddha Puja, and then there's offerings, and then there's more offerings, and then just when you think it's about to start, there's even more offerings, and scented roses. And I often wondered about this, because sometimes it really does take like a program in India. You're going to be there for hours. And I thought, oh, God, why do they do so much at the beginning? And I thought, oh, they're preparing the mind. And actually, when you give a talk in that way, you also feel like in such a good mood because it's so evocative that it's very easy to give a talk. And I find that even here, you know, when I came to Berlin, I was welcomed so warmly, and I've been on the end of such hospitality and joyful communication. It does prepare the mind, you know, it prepares you for coming to a Buddhist centre and seeing people. So yeah, it's a bit like preparing for a guest. You tidy up the house, you get some food in. And it's not that you're just preparing the house for their arrival, it's also that you're preparing yourself for their coming. You're preparing yourself for their arrival. And I was thinking about preparation as well, in the sense that it's not just an individual act, it's also collective. So I think collectively we can prepare for the stranger. So I noticed this in Tiratnaloka because we've got, as some of you know, we've got this big project where we're doing something so ridiculous, which is we're going to sell our building and fundraise and buy a bigger building because we've got these huge waiting lists. There's more people on the waiting list than there are on retreat. So we want to scrap waiting lists. We want to get a bigger building. And I realised that the only reason that's been an idea for many years, but it's only come about now, and it's come about because the team are prepared. Because collectively, we've reached a point of a deep harmony with each other and a depth, a real collective depth in the team. You can feel it quite palpably in our team that collectively we've gone somewhere. There's a very strong commitment to Buddhist practice, a very strong commitment to communication, and a very strong commitment to what's called the Bodhisattva ideal. And that has taken a life of its own. So when I do my sadhana practice now, part of it is visualizing yourself as White Tara. I realise that I'm not visualizing myself as White Tara, I'm visualizing the whole team as White Tara. But that wasn't a conscious choice, like, oh, it'd be a really good idea to do that. It's almost like I've stopped being one person. I'm very individual, but I've stopped being quite just an isolated individual. And I think because we were ready, even though we're a bit short-staffed until Virya D is going to come and rescue us, and in a way it's a stupid time to take on this project. It's the perfect time to take on this project because we're prepared. So there's preparation and then there's waiting. Waiting as an open state. Sangharakshita says you're just turning things over in your mind and looking at them in a gentle way. So I think this idea of waiting is also very, very important. In Pali, it's to wait for, the word to wait for also means to welcome. So it's a particular kind of waiting. It's not waiting for a bus in the rain. So I live in rural Wales, and sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes the bus just doesn't come, and then you have to wait 2 hours for the next bus. So, and sometimes it's raining, and there's a great conflict in one's being about wanting to be home and actually being there standing for a bus in the rain. So waiting isn't just about a conflict, like you're waiting for someone who's late and you're a bit annoyed. It doesn't mean that. And it doesn't mean waiting for a big experience, a bit like that solitary retreat I had. You're not trying to force an experience to happen. Sangharakshita said that's like trying to pull a flower fully formed from the earth. It's about being open and receptive and allowing the mind to welcome whatever one's current experience actually is. And I think in some ways in society we've forgotten how to wait. You know, I think I have learnt a lot more about waiting in India as well. We're living in the countryside and then in India where, you know, your train can be 48 hours late, no problem. And the Indians just don't care. They're like, right, okay, time for snacks. And I think in a particular, you know, I think things are changing now. The advantage of mobile phones is you know what's happening all the time. But the disadvantage is that we hardly ever wait, because what happens is you just take out your mobile phone and there's a constant source of distraction. But But I've noticed that if I put down the mobile phone and I'm waiting for whatever I'm waiting for, and I just open myself up, all sorts of magical things can happen, like little connections with people, or people talking to you, and you find out about other people's lives, or you suddenly notice your surroundings, strange little flowers growing up through the crack, or a bit of graffiti, or a nice looking rock. Or even just yourself and what you're actually feeling and what your body is actually doing in that moment. So yes, sometimes I think it's good to be bored, because in that boredom something can emerge that's a bit unknown and a bit mysterious. But you have to wait. Bhante said about boredom, he said you just have to stay with it long enough so that you don't do something just to get away from your boredom. So just being bored is quite an interesting experience. And then you can muse and muse. You know, your mind goes from different ideas and different thoughts, and something new can emerge in your mind as you wait. As if you give it a bit of space, something new can emerge in the mind. But who are we waiting for? You know, so we're waiting there with an open mind, but who are we waiting for? The stranger, or what Kabir calls the guest, the transcendent, the Buddha, White Tara. In a way, I don't really want to define it, because I think it's left undefined in the poem. You have to find out yourself who the stranger is. So it's undefined, it's kind of beyond our current experience, and yet the implication is that we'll recognise them when they come. We went to the Asian exhibition in the museum in Berlin, and there's a beautiful little relief sculpture which I recommend you see, which has the Buddha represented as a pillar of fire. Originally the Buddha was never depicted in human form, he was depicted by his absence. So an empty footprint, or an empty throne, or in this example, an empty throne with just a pillar of fire. So there's always within it a kind of presence and an absence of the Buddha. He's sort of known, you know it's him, you know that pillar of fire represents the Buddha, you know he's there, but at the same time he's also absent. In the poem, the speaker says, "But felt he had come and stayed waiting outside, and I listened, and I was afraid." So in there's fear of the unknown, there's fear of change. And I think it is also very interesting to find the bit of us that just doesn't want to change, that doesn't want to grow, that is quite happy with the way things are, and, you know, that doesn't want to make changes in their lives, or even to see the truth. It's a funny thing about reality itself. We sort of want it, and yet we don't want it at the same time. And increasingly I'm interested in that part of myself, or in the part of other people that says no. Like, what are they saying? What are they trying to communicate? And getting into dialogue with the bits of myself that just say no. You know, what do I give to my process of change, and then what do I hold back? You know, yeah, you can change that bit, but not that. But here, with this imagery, you've got a kind of a very, very alive moment just before something comes into being, just before this union happens, whatever the union is. And fear is not always a bad thing. It means that we're stepping into uncharted waters. We're stepping from the known to the unknown. It's a natural response to the unknown to feel fear. And in Buddhism, what we call, the word that is used for this kind of fear is Sangharakshita, which means agitation, fear, anxiety, thrill, and religious emotion. And that's how the Buddha described the spiritual life. He said there's what we call the ignoble quest, or the quest. There's a quest for the familiar. He says, when I was an unenlightened bodhisattva, myself subject to birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow and defilement, I sought what was likewise subject to birth, sickness, death, sorrow and defilement, which means there's a kind of search for the familiar that goes round and round the same thing. Quest in Buddhism is pariasana, and pari means going around or encircling, and asana means desire. So your desires encircle the known. So that's one kind of search, or one kind of path, is just to go round the same thing, encircle the known again and again and again. But he said the noble quest is actually going, your desires encircling the unknown. What if I were to seek the unborn, unaging, unailing, deathless, sorrowless, and undefiled, supreme rest from burden, nibbana? And I think that's really bold. I think it's really bold, because how do you know what you don't, like, how do you know you want your desires? How can your desires circle what you don't already know? And I think the only answer to that is that in some way you do know it. There's something unfamiliar and strange, and yet you know it very deeply. So even though there's the unknown, the stranger, the guest, it's deeply felt. It's a presence waiting outside the door that we know deeply. And what Sangharakshita says to do about that is, he says, the way is to learn simply to concentrate initially on the idea of the noble quest, the idea of the spiral. We have to learn to appreciate in the full sense of that word. We have to learn to be moved by its beauty. We have to learn to be emotionally stirred by it. And then when we've learned to appreciate to some extent, when we are moved to some extent by its beauty, emotionally stirred by it, then from deep within there will arise at least the germ, at least the glimmering of the noble quest itself. So yes, so at one hand there's the unknown, the unborn, unaging, unailing, freedom from burden, nibbana, which is all described in the negative because it's unknown, and yet we know it, and yet we feel it deeply. So all we're asked to do is to be still with that part of us that knows what's good and true and beautiful, and to be moved by it, and to have that kind of electric current of possibility, that confidence or trust or faith that there is a state of being beyond the known. And how do we develop that trust that something lies beyond? In a way, I don't think you can develop it. I think you have to learn to listen to it, because it's there within your being, within all of our beings. Bhante says of this poem, he says it's a dialogue poem. And in a way, it's a dialogue between the known and the unknown. One of whom speaks and the other is silent, but they're both there. One of them is waiting for something to happen, and perhaps the other is also waiting for something to happen. So I think we need that kind of trust, that sort of deep listening to the unknown within us, the unconditioned and unconfined within us. Because the other side of Sangvega, the other side of that kind of fear and urgency, is despondency. He'll never come now. You know, there's that bit in the poem where she's just thinking he's never going to come. But we have to trust that it is possible, and it will come if we prepare our minds. The stranger isn't the stranger forever. And it's unclear to me in that poem, also I quite like it, because she's inside in her simple room and the stranger is outside, and it's unclear whether the stranger is going to come in or she's going to have to go out. Again in Kabir there's a poem where he says, the spiritual athlete often changes the colour of his clothes and his mind remains grey and loveless. He sits inside a shrine room all day so that the guest has to go outdoors and praise the rocks. So sometimes we have to go outside, you know, we have to go outside, try something different, leave behind also a familiar environment. But if we do that, if we engage with that preparation, and if we trust, if we listen to that voice of the unknown within us, the stranger is there just waiting. So I thought I'd end with, I'll end with the poem again. I'll end with the poem and then I'll end with Kabir. So we'll see what we think. I listened all day for the knock of the stranger, and I often looked out from the door. The table was scrubbed, the brass shining, and well swept the floor. The shadows grew longer and longer. In the grate the fire flickered and died. It's too late now. He will never come. He never will come now, I said and sighed. I sat there musing and musing, the spinning wheel still at my side. The moonlight came in through the window, white like a bride. As the clock struck 12, I heard nothing, but felt he had come and stayed, waiting outside. And I listened, and I was afraid. So this is Kabir. The woman who is separated from her lover spins at the spinning wheel. The Baghdad of the body rises with its towers and gates. Inside it, the palace of intelligence has been built. The wheel of ecstatic love turns around in the sky, and the spinning seat is made of the sapphires of work and study. This woman weaves threads that are subtle, and the intensity of her praise makes them fine. Kabir says, I am that woman. I am weaving the linen of night and day. When my lover comes and I feel his feet, the gift I will have for him is tears.